at the end of the Civil War, obviously you had what was called the Reconstruction, and so there was a lot of things imposed upon, basically in the South, that changed completely how their whole culture had been, and that is with the end of slavery, and then giving the black the votes, and this created tremendous upheaval, and so when Reconstruction ended, it went from 1865 to 1877, and so it was about 12 years. Then that left them kind of free to do what they wanted, and so and with this tremendous loss that happened, and you know, when your whole way of life is totally changed, totally shattered, you know, all the devastation and so on from the war and so on, you know, you try to explain things, you try to justify that and that loss and what you did. And so what kind of developed in that period was what historians have called the lost cause a history or understanding of things. And it was during that period that you saw, and also beginning in the Reconstruction, you saw the rise of the Klan. And so that was supposedly battling all these injustices that the North was putting on, and changes, at least initially. And then you also saw that there was this rise and this glorification of basically what had happened in the war, and even though that they lost. And so you saw in this 30-year period this huge undertaking of all the monuments to the Confederacy. And so the statue of Robert E. Lee that was in Richmond, and so on and so forth, that all came about in this time, and the memorials down in Shiloh. And I speak of Shiloh because I've been there, in Tennessee, one of the battlefields, and many of the others. And not only the Union, but you know, the Confederacy. And so there was this narrative that developed and such, justifying those things, and that permeated the understanding and so on. And so we found that our fellowship, like the others down there, were deeply influenced by the culture, weren't any different. And so we, having that apocalyptic heritage of that separation, you know, from the culture, we kind of kept that in, but also we failed to realize that we're influenced by all these things that we said that we were against, meaning the culture, yet we're very influenced by the culture. And so thus it went in our history. And so by the 1910s, long before the deep acculturation of Christian America and embrace of denominational identity, our white churches of Christ has so thoroughly adopted if you will, the racial status quo. In other words, just accepting this as the way it was, and even influencing that. One should not be surprised then to discover that in the 1920s and 30s, the racial views within the church mimicked those of the broader culture. It was just so. It's sad, but it was so. And so what were Jim Crow laws? Now, we've all heard of these. In fact, recently in the political last couple of years, these terminologies were brought up. But anyhow, Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized basically racial segregation. So once the Reconstruction, once the Union troops pulled out, these things started developing. And so, named after a black minstrel show character, the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. And those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and even death. And so it was this period of separation. Now, if you're a moviegoer, there's been lots of movies that have dealt with these kind of topics. And so, to kind of illustrate, some of what that was. And so this was predominantly in the South, but that doesn't mean there wasn't some of this in the North. And it didn't mean that attitudes weren't in the North also, but nonetheless. Historian Nancy McLean's study of the 1920s Klan found the Churches of Christ were one of the Protestant groups who in particular flocked to the Klan along with Methodists and Baptists. James Allen, editor of the Gospel Advocate in the 1920s, claimed many of the preachers were members. And that was in the Gospel Advocate in May 14th, 1925. And one student of race relations among Churches of Christ reported that many members of the Churches of Christ belonged to the Klan in that period. It was interesting. I was talking to a member here, and a long-time member here. And when she grew up, and when I was preparing this actually about 2 years ago, and I'm talking to her about this just to get her understanding and views on this, and she said, yeah, that's kind of what it was. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in those situations participated in that, but it's like that was kind of the way it was. And so what do you do? But nonetheless, and I just found that very interesting because, the kid here that grew up in St. Louis County, born in 61, I didn't experience things like this. Not that it was all this or that, but, it was just interesting. So now the Christian Leader, which was one of the publications, allowed an open debate in 1923 on the question, can a Christian join the Klan? And in written debate, some writers openly endorsed the Klan as carrying out God's will, even as other men and women wrote against the Klan on moral and religious grounds. Steeped in the apocalyptic heritage, H. Leo Bowles argued against Klan membership in 1927, though his reasoning appeared more legalistic than moral in his opposition. And so, again, it complicated. And people were all in different places with this, if you will. Austin McGarry, who formed the Firm Foundation, and we talked about him in the rough and tumble Texas, he critiqued the Klan in the 1920s as well. In the 1923 Houston Chronicle article, he explained why he rejected the 1920s Klan, yet supported the Reconstruction-era Klan. According to McGarry, the former was rooted in patriotism and protection of Southerners, whereas the latter was born of greed, desire, and political influence. And so you see all this dividing and so on and parsing and things like that was, in other words, all different places in the spectrum on this subject. In other words, these excesses and things that were happening certainly later on, found objectionable, but when they started, it was, better is kind of how the thinking is. So the pattern of segregation permeated the culture, increasingly dominated the lives of the individual congregations and institutions of our fellowship in the early 20th century. G.C. Brewer, who we've talked about extensively, for example, candidly recalled the years of his youth in Tennessee in the early 20th century. None of us thought of inviting Negroes into our homes as guests or sitting down to eat with them at the same table. We felt as a matter of course that they should have the same food that we ate, but that they should eat in the kitchen of the servants' quarters. Brewer acknowledged that this was a condition that prevailed and we accepted as right and satisfactory. At the same time, he would resolutely affirm that we were not prejudiced against Negroes. And so, the point is, again, that it's really complicated how we think about these things and so on and so forth. And so in that time period, this was how it was thought. And again, the purpose of this is not to be critical, in a sense, from our perspective, or at least from my point, but it's because I don't think we'd be any different. Yet as we look at this, we're kind of horrified at these views and things like that. But nonetheless, The segregation of Churches of Christ institutions happened in various ways. The separation often entailed a white congregation purchasing a separate building for black worship and paying a black preacher, often inadequately, according to black leader F.F. Carson. As S.E. Harris wrote in 1907, as soon as there were enough Negroes in the white church to start a colored church, they would build them a house of worship in, like the old brethren did 15 or 20 years ago. In other words, the idea is, okay, you got to be here is not enough, but when there's enough, we're gonna give you a place. And of course, that is, a long-established way that they were doing things. Paternalism. Alexander Bigby Lipscomb, David's nephew, submitted to the Gospel Advocate a classic description of this pattern in 1921. After meetings in Valdosta, Georgia had resulted in 166 baptisms, through the efforts of the white disciples, a large, commodious house has been secured and regular worship prevails. Alexander announced his conviction that we whites have never made a better investment for the Lord, nor any which brought such quick and happy results, he added. New religious and moral status for the Negro element meant they had better farmhands, better porters, better cooks, better housemaids than ever before. Despite David Lipscomb's strong, consistent stance against segregating congregations by race, integrated congregations were almost non-existent by the 60s. And so this long development pattern is why you have, while there's black congregations and white congregations, and it wasn't just with our fellowship. That was kind of the way it was. And of course, they viewed this as, hey, this is a good thing. Look, we're providing places for you to be. And then the idea is, you know what, that's going to make them better cooks and porters and so on and so forth. In other words, those lower-end jobs, if you will, that it had consistently done. And so, again, it's just, that's how they thought. That's all they knew, and couldn't see things a little differently than that. The racial division of the church, which included rejection of fellowship by segregating churches and schools, demonstrates that even those deeply indebted to apocalypticism's critique of culture were unable or unwilling to resist society's practices regarding race, even in the church buildings. And so even though there was a claim of we're not part of this culture, we're part of the kingdom of God, was greatly influenced by that which was rejected. Segregated churches were the most obvious indication that white churches, when it came to race, acted sociologically more like a denomination than a sect from the very inception of our formation, long before World War I and subsequent divisions that we've talked about. And so again, very complex. How could white churches of Christ so thoroughly exchange the apocalyptic perspective for Southern white racial views? Well, as they look at this, there's probably three reasons how this developed. One was Lipscomb's apocalyptic theology focused on the church rather than society, nullifying a thorough engagement of sociology or the social gospel. Further, there were those who developed an all-out assault on the social gospel in the early decades of the 20th century, which corroborated the individualism and relationalism at the heart of Lipscomb's apocalypticism. Got a lot of big words here. We'll talk about it. Focusing only on individuals, congregations, and enhancing personal relationships rather than on the ways social practices and policies were in fact influencing Christian minds and hearts and producing ignorance on racial issues. So what is this saying? As we've mentioned before, it's this idea of what is our faith? Is our faith this privatized relationship with God? You know, me and Jesus, and we get that right. Well, is that all there is? Is that all what the faith is supposed to be? Then there's others that looked at, wait, our faith is supposed to make things better, make the kingdom of God here on earth in a better way. And so if there's these injustices and these wrongs, shouldn't we be trying to change those things, is how the discussion goes. Bill? Oh, well, you were like signaling me, and so I was, you look like you were chomping at the bit. Sure. Sure. Mm-hmm.
If a black person would come into my church, or Frank would come into my church, see, all I see every day is them fellowshipping with each other and being friendly.
Mm-hmm.
We would get up and leave. We would get up and leave. These two best friends of my family, this lady told me that. Sweetest lady I thought I'd ever known.
Yeah.
The roots go back so deep.
Yeah.
On this segregation, on this separation, on this prejudice. It's terrible.
So it was a deep, complicated thing. I know you were sharing some, Betty, some about your growing up.
Yes, I never saw a person of color except one until I was 18 years old.
Wow.
In Bonne Terre, I lived in Deloge, a small mining town, lead mining. Bonne Terre was also a small mining town. I did not know this at the time, but there was a small community of black people then in Bonne Terre. Every once in a great while, there was an elderly black gentleman that came to our congregation. He sat on the back seat. He was always acknowledged and
Sure.
I guess I remember this not so much that he was a person of color, but because he was pointed out and acknowledged that he was welcome there. And I wasn't curious about it then.
You didn't know to be.
No,
You're a
didn't know
kid.
the difference.
Yeah.
And finally, when I was about 18 and on one of my first jobs, there was a colored person who was a custodian there.
Mhm.
He is a very nice gentleman, and he came to me one day and he said one of the doctors had asked him to deliver a package to Flat River. He says, I don't know the area, but I'm not comfortable going there. And I'll tell you why. I asked my dad why there were no people of color in Deloge. And he told me, at one time, some men got together from Flat River and Deloge, and I'm not proud of this,
Yeah.
but they railroaded the black community out of town. To this day, I don't know if there are any people of colors there or not. I haven't been there, haven't lived there for some time, but at the time I left, there were not. And I don't think in Flat River. There were people in Farmington, and I worked there in the 50s. At that time, every year, the black community held a benefit and sold tickets to have lunch. Some other office workers and myself
Mhm.
bought tickets, and we ate in their homes, and it was delicious. And they were we were comfortable,
yeah.
and they were very comfortable with us. But that's the way it was at that time. This was the 40s and then the 50s.
Yeah. And so, these things, unfortunate and sad as they are, but to a kid like me growing up, it's kind of like you maybe knew or heard of things, but never really affected or touched, at least in my case. And so, just didn't realize the extent. But then, I remember, and I think I've shared this before, when I was reading this book about 5-6 years ago, whenever I was reading, I was in Pittsburgh for it. We were in Pittsburgh when I was reading this section, and I just started crying. I had no idea of things. And again, it's not meant to condemn or to put down or whatever, but this was kind of the sad history. And the thing is, it kind of affects things. And so it's important that, yes.
You have the opposite of that. I can remember when we were traveling one time, going to church, and it was an all-black congregation.
Mm-hmm.
All very interesting because they amened an awful lot.
Well, but black congregations culturally tend to be more vocal, if you want, for whatever reason, and yeah, and so just very interesting. I remember when I was in South Carolina, I think I shared this. I went with a coworker. I was trying to get her to come to church. Well, come to mine. It's okay. And it was back in the woods, and it was an all black congregation. We were the only white people there. And it was charismatic, and so it was very lively, and it went on about 2.5, 3 hours, I think. This was a Sunday night service, by the way, and it was very, very interesting, and they were those where the women couldn't wear pants or jewelry or so on and so forth. They were that kind of understanding and but it was very interesting. But so, those, huh?
Your congregation was predominantly black. You're saying the women couldn't wear. I grew up in.
Yeah.
I'm older than you.
Yeah.
But I grew up in. Don't say like I know. He just jumped right on that, didn't he?
Sorry.
In Yukon, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And I remember one time us in the youth group, us girls, we got together and we decided, it was either a Sunday night service or a Wednesday night service. We decided we were all going to wear pants to church. anymore, they're pants. 'Cause
Yeah.
And we all got pulled in by the elders, you know, for wearing pants to a Sunday night or Wednesday night service.
Sure.
Like Betty and Shetty said, you know, we were an all-white congregation, so I don't know that it's necessarily.
Well, correct. I'm glad you pointed it out. I wasn't implying that that was a black congregation or white. That was just a thinking of many back then. And so, but I'm saying they were a congregation that in the 1980s, that in the 1980s was still very much practicing that. Huh?
That was the 60s.
Sure. Well, this was the 80s. Now, this teacher, you know, this gal I worked with, she didn't dress in skirts at home when she went to work,
Right.
and she didn't necessarily agree with it, but it was that's what it was.
Yeah.
And so just interesting how these things, you know, we look at now of where we're at and how we think today, and yet that was, you know, there was book, chapter, and verse to justify
Oh my
why you
goodness.
didn't wear pants or you didn't wear jewelry, right?
I can remember the first time I wore slacks.
Yeah.
And there's probably comments. Yeah, you know, and again, just seeing these things, and again, not trashing that, but just let us realize that things change, and they aren't always as they always were, where we are now. And so anyhow,
Grant.
yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, it's still not real good for the blacks. I mean, you know, because Liam and Nevaeh, they go to school and they're probably maybe, for a while they were the only blacks there. And they're bullied,
Yeah.
you know, it's just different where you are and where you live.
Sure.
And
Oh.
it's kind of sad, you think it's all better, but it's not.
Well, correct.
It's not right, it's not.
Those attitudes are not all gone, but they're also not so sanctioned as they once were, and it's not to the degree that it was. I mean, I told you about coaching football. You know, Parkway North, we had quite a few black kids, and we would go to other places, and they'd get it. And fancy, expensive private schools in St. Louis County, you'd be hearing the players saying that. So there's that kind of stuff that goes on even today, and of course, you know, a sinful world that we're in. But it's certainly not like it once was. Amen to that.
Yeah.
You know, and so anyhow, and so again, this bigger idea of what is our faith to be? Is it just our own personalized thing and how much that we know in our own head and how much we understand things and seeking after truth, or is it supposed to have effect other than just convincing people to understand things the way we do? You know, what is that? Well, that's kind of what that debate is, and things that started happening in the 20th century with others in what they called the social gospel. There was those that said, hey, Christians, we need to Christianize these things, make them more Christ-like for the betterment of the world. And of course, that challenged that more personal understanding. Now, not saying that that's all right, because there was obviously critiques that went on that. They said, wait a minute, you all are viewing these changes as most important and are forgetting these bare essential, these basic fundamental things of truth in the Gospels. You know, and as I mentioned before in one of the books that I read, you know, trying to find out answers, that it seemed that more liberal theologically thinking people tended to be much more into what was called the social gospel. Okay? Well, when those people that were minded that way felt that these other church organizations, meaning these other groups that are trying to change society that weren't the church, if you will, that they kind of gravitated there and even left their more liberal churches because they're saying, wait a minute, these groups are being more effective than the church is at changing these things. And so in their minds, they kind of equated that I'm doing this good and this importance. And so, anyhow, it's very, very interesting as what it goes on. So anyhow, this is one of the aspects as to how this came about. Now, the apocalyptic worldview assured believers that they could belong to the kingdom of God alone and stand together separate and apart from the values of the world. And of course, that's what's so long. We're not them, all these others, we're right, so on and so forth. In fact, the values of the world had formed our thinking far more than they realized or admitted. They were influenced by the culture while denying the influence. And that's a subject that we've touched on from the very beginning, that, are we aware of these influences? Because we think, oh, that doesn't apply. Well, maybe it does. White Church of Christ leaders, hailed predominantly from the South, had absorbed the culture's education on racial perspective and experience that they never fully criticized. More often than not, the racial culture was adopted. This acculturation demonstrates the ad hoc and inconsistent ways that our apocalyptic heritage was appropriated. In other words, we claim this, yet we're still highly influenced by this. And one thing is, that's just how people are. We're not near as consistent as we think we are. We might try to be, but that's just kind of what it is. White leaders did not listen well to black leaders who publicly critiqued the racial issues of the church. To be sure, there were examples of cooperation that proved to be powerful exceptions to the norm, but these were unique situations. Paternalistic attitudes fostered an unwillingness among most to hear the black perspective. Okay, we're going to get into more detail on that. If such attitudes could prevail at a time when many churches of Christ self-consciously sought to live as citizens of the kingdom of the God and critique of the world, it was natural that racial issues would intensify in later years. In other words, if we're claiming this strong separation from the world in the kingdom of God, and yet still are having, accepting these cultural ways of viewing things, that in later years, when that perspective, as we documented a lot from World War I to World War II, kind of diminished and wasn't nearly as significant, that these concerns would grow less. When our leaders abandoned the apocalyptic vision after World War I and embarked on a program of systemic acculturation, most white churches of Christ failed to resist the racial influence of the culture and its influence in the church. And again, just kind of the way it goes. As churches of Christ built their identity in the 50s and 60s, these deeply embedded views shaped our response to the upheaval of the civil rights movement in the 60s. So when culture blew up in the 60s, with all that going on, what was our response? It's no surprise then that black churches of Christ developed their own institutions in the first half of the 20th century and finally chose independence by the late 1960s, and we're going to chronicle that. There's not a lot of historical sources and accounts to tell the story of early black converts to the Stone Campbell movement in the early 19th century. But sources claim that they were numbered around 7,000 African Americans by the end of the Civil War. Now, there was huge quantities in the Methodists and also in the Baptists and even in the Episcopalians. And so one of the books on your reading list kind of chronicles a lot of that. The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity talks about these things. And so there was a lot of that, and part of that was the view was, as Christians, we've got to save their souls. And so there was a lot of outreach to the slave community that happened in that time. In the late 19th century, black churches of Christ in the South took on the defining religious and doctrinal positions of the white churches. Their view of Scripture and their commitment to restoring the ancient order, the aversion to instrumental music and missionary societies mirrored the theological perspectives of the white cohorts. And now it's interesting, this is getting a little ahead, but today, whereas more of the mainline congregations and so on have moved away from as exclusive of an attitude on these issues, many of the black churches, not all, but kind of stayed embedded in that older time. Not everybody, but nonetheless, those views. For this reason, black leaders among churches of Christ divided from the black Christian churches. Remember, we've been looking at everything from a Church of Christ perspective. This stuff was going on in the Christian churches, disciples, and so on and so forth. Also, and the Stone Campbell movement group that used instruments in worship and supported missionary societies. In Nashville, leaders including Alexander Cleveland Campbell. So remember, back in the day when you name your kids after people you admire, presidents and so on and so forth, and Samuel Womack separated from the black Christian churches to form the Jackson Street Church of Christ around 1900. Jackson Street became a focal point of networking where G.P. Bowser, who we'll talk about extensively in a little bit, and Marshall Keeble were mentored by Campbell and Womack. So this congregation has a lot of significance in the history of the black churches as we look at it. They were a very influential and important congregation. There were earlier and other influential leaders, but Jackson Street provides one example of the way black churches of Christ mirrored white churches of Christ. Throughout the Jim Crow era, Fanning and Lipscomb's The Gospel Advocate shaped the theological perspective of black leaders, even as they developed their own magazine, which was called the Christian Echo, Networks, Traditions, and Institutions. In other words, the Christian Echo for the black community was like the firm foundation, the Gospel Advocate, and others. And not that they didn't have influence otherwise, but nonetheless. Now, let's begin looking at these two traditions, these two approaches that the black brothers and sisters used in dealing with all this. One was called the accommodationist tradition, of which Marshall Keeble, who we introduced kind of before, was probably the most well-known and honored, if you will, person in this approach. If we wish to understand black churches of Christ in America, we need to realize two traditions coexisted in the heritage from the earliest years of the 20th century. The standard pattern of institutional segregation as exemplified in the poignant story of Marshall Keeble. Because of his ability to move crowds and win converts, Keeble distinguished himself as the most successful of all black preachers among churches of Christ in the early 20th century. Eventually, he routinely made hundreds of converts in week-long gospel meetings and revivals in black communities of the South. Under his preaching, there was thousands that were baptized over his career. Some have said he was the most successful of any Church of Christ preacher, white, black, or in the whole country. So he was very powerful. Now, I don't know, did anybody here ever see him? Because he passed in the late 60s. Did you see him? Hear him?
He came to Harding several times while I was there. He could come in here and he could talk to any one of us at our level. You could be a PhD or you could be a field hand. And he would communicate at your level. And he loved to talk to people. He loved people.
Yeah.
He would come to the student center and there'd be some of the football players all sitting. He'd get us all together and start talking to them. And he'd talk football.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a marvelous communicator.
So this is in the 60s, right?
61, 62.
Okay, early 60s.
He would have been close to the end. Let's see, 68 when he passed away. I didn't realize that, but
I think it was 68.
he was an old man. And he had 2 or 3 young guys that traveled with him that he was mentoring. But they couldn't hold a candle to him.
Sure. So he was big, if you will. Now it's interesting that he was on campus because, but at that time, black students couldn't.
There were no black students
No.
at all on campus.
Yeah.
I asked about that, and he was given some very specific reasons.
Yeah.
Dr. Danis straightened me out on that issue. I came from up here, we were integrated up here.
Yeah.
Got down there, and that's something.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But so yeah, just a really powerful guy. However, it was kind of sad. Throughout his career, Keeble remained almost entirely dependent on financial support of the white power structure in Churches of Christ. One of his biographers contends that no other religious group in the South had singled out one lone Negro, heaped upon him more personal honors than has the Church of Christ on Marshall Keeble. Keeble made the most of the situation using the white support for purposes he deemed important, such as educating young black preachers. And so basically, here was a guy that was willing to put up with all the stuff and the humiliation and even the insult so that he could get support to do what he wanted to do. And as a result of that, those in our fellowship, oh, he's great. Why don't y'all act like him? Why aren't you like him? Okay, and so we're going to see that there were those that said, no, I'm not going to accept that. But anyhow, in the early 1940s, Keeble had an exchange with 4E Wallace that reflects the pattern of segregation that was common. Wallace initiated the exchange when he complained that certain black preachers were attracting large numbers of whites to their meetings. Wallace doubtless had Keeble in mind when he complained that if any white preacher would say everything that they, the black preachers say to a word, it would sound so common that the brethren would stop it. But when a Negro says it in Negro manner, the brethren paw the ground over. Oh my gosh. You know, that was the view. Well, because they're saying that's nothing ordinary, but you're saying it because, oh, that's the greatest thing in the world. And so he's showing, you know, kind of how he thought about stuff. He went on to say that reliable reports have come to me of white women, members of the church, becoming so animated over a certain colored preacher as to go up to him after a sermon and shake hands with him, holding his hand in both of theirs. Oh my goodness, contact. In Wallace's view, that kind of thing will make the fools out of the Negroes. Further, for any woman in the church who so forget her dignity and lower herself so, just because a Negro has learned enough about the gospel to preach to his race, is pitiable indeed. Just, wow, just kind of makes your jaw fall. Yet, that was not uncommon. Wallace commended another model instead. When N.B. Hardeman, and remember, he had the big, for weeks at a time, thousands and thousands came to hear him at the Rhineman, which is where the Grand Ole Opry was originally, in the 20s, and I think even in the 30s he did some. So he was big. Freed Hardeman University, that's Hardeman. When N.B. Hardeman held at the valley-wide meetings in Harlington, Texas, some misguided brethren brought a group of Negroes up front to be introduced to and shake hands with him. Brother Hardeman told him publicly that he could see all the colored brethren he cared to see on the outside after services, and he would say everything to them he wanted to without the formality of shaking hands. And so again, these great men, and I'm not saying they weren't, yet we see that they were so influenced by their culture. Without meaning to do so, Wallace offered perhaps the most telling reason for racial division in the churches in the 20th century when he wrote that an acceptable black preacher is one who knows what his relationships are in the church in the light of his relationships within society. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the values of white Southern culture defined our racial posture. And again, was that everybody, every place, everything, and what degree? No, because we've already realized those things. But nonetheless, this was part of it. And again, not unique to us. That was what people were dealing with. And so we're going to see how that brought in what became the whole civil rights explosion in the 60s. It was kind of like bottled up for so long that it just exploded. And so these are the reasons behind it. So no one protested Wallace's harangue in print at any rate. In other words, again, we have all this because they wrote it in their journals. You can go and look and see. And so no one seemed to protest that view. But relations between races were such among Churches of Christ in the 40s that Keble felt constrained to abase himself before Wallace in the next issue of the Bible Banner. For over 30 years, Keble wrote, I have tried to conduct my work just as your article in the Bible Banner of March suggested. In other words, he's reading what Wallace wrote that we just saw. Taking advice from such friends as you have been for years has been such a blessing to my work. So I take the privilege to thank you for the instructive and encouraging article. I hope I can conduct myself in my last days so that you and none of my friends will have to take back nothing they have said complimentary about my work and regret it. So what is he doing? He's just accepting it in the right word, but he's writing it like that, saying okay, because he wanted he needed the support, and so yes, and so it isn't that he liked that, but he kind of that's how he worked.
It also kind of was a dig.
Well, of course it was, and again, Wallace was quick to commend Keble's compliant spirit. He couldn't even recognize it. This letter is characteristic of the humility of Mr. Keble. It is a reason why he's the greatest colored preacher that ever lived. And so you see all this. Why? Because in his view, well, he's acting like he should. He knows his place. He's falling in line. He's doing what we think. And it's black preachers like Keble, Wallace affirm, know their place and stay in it, even when some white brethren try to take them out of it. In other words, ones that try to give them a little more equality. So that's what he's hitting at. Yet, according to blacks who knew Keble well, Wallace's betrayal of Keble was way off base. In other words, he might have said that publicly, but behind the scenes, he was not unaware, if you will. And we will stop there. So thank you, and we will continue next week.